So as we go through, I always want to make sure I first point out by thanking the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board. The Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board funds roughly 80% of my program. I should say all checkoff dollars fund 80 to 90% of my program on an annual basis. So it's the growers here through that fund through the North Central Soybean Research Program. Your state checkoffs fund myself and Dr. Laura Lindsay. So again, I just want to thank the farmers and acknowledge that fact. That's who drives my research program on the farmers across not just Wisconsin, but across the Midwest. So a couple things I want to point out as we go through. I always like to look a little bit back in my rearview mirror as I look forward. One of the interesting things, and many of you have probably noted this, and I think Joe Lauer may have mentioned this yesterday. He wasn't here, but he was over in Shipshewana, Indiana, speaking. And basically the point being is next year, 2018, the last report I saw, there's going to be 90 million acres of corn planted and 90 million acres of soybean planted. Okay? The guess is, depending on what happens with prices, the movement, this is 2018 will be the first year that soybean acres surplant corn acres U.S.-wide. So that's kind of the estimate out there right now. So again, some of the things to put in the back of your mind that some of the reasons there's differences we're going to see with that. The main one, there's going to be a lot of second year and third year beans, fourth year beans, just because, as I've been told, farmers will lose less money planting soybean than corn. That's the main driver of doing this. So if you have any questions on planting second or third year beans, I would go back to my blog. My blog is called the Soy Report. Just Google that, and I'm not going to go through that today. The other point I want to make is to kind of address the state that I work in, as you see here. And I had a couple unique phenomenons happen to me last year. So I had to abandon my Platteville site. That's on the lower southwest corner. They think they're part of Iowa. That's what they always think they are. They don't. That's what they always tell me. That's the site that I usually get 100 bushel soybeans at. Last 2016, I actually had 8 varieties go over 100 bushels per acre, just so you have a frame of reference. This is a long-term no-till site. We planted it a little late just because of weather conditions. Again, this is probably at least 20 years of no-till. The day after I planted it, we got a 5-inch pounding rain. Okay, it's sealed by no-till location tight. I've never seen that happen before in my life. I dropped 165,000 seeds. I only got about 20,000 up on a per acre basis. So again, something to kind of think about as we go through as some of these climate issues come to us, that those events are frequently occurring, and just some ways to think about mitigating and managing that. The other site, my East Troy site, I had another unique phenomenon occur, is that my technician went down there the week after, it would have been the 4th of July, and goes, "There's something wrong with these beans." He goes, half of them are cupped. Any guess what might have happened there? We had a little off-target movement of a certain class of herbicide that tagged all of my non-extend soybeans. So that's how I knew what happened, because all my extend beans were perfect, but all my non-extend beans weren't. So again, even us on the research side have to deal with these off-target movements, and I'm not going to get into that stuff. I think Bill Johnson will probably be speaking about that this afternoon. So again, just to kind of get you all aware that we deal with similar things as you all do. How did they yield? So I will get to that. Okay? I will get to that in a second. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. This is the new maturity group map that we put out there. And if you can look here across the state of Ohio, right there. So on that line would be a 3.0 maturity group bean. And then obviously this line right here would be a 4 maturity group bean. So this is data that we were able to collect from all of the public, basically, variety testing programs. So we're able to collect data from Laura Lindsay's project and all the states. So again, this is a new maturity group map. If anyone is interested in utilizing this, and as you can tell, we have these different colorations on here, and that's basically the standard error around those. And we generally see, on average, a full maturity group swing within a given region that yield the same. And what I mean by that, if we're going to the southern part of Wisconsin, we'll usually see a late 2 being the highest yielding variety. But we were in a starred system, so that means any variety that yields similarly to that highest yielding variety gets a star on it. And we'll see a full maturity group difference in starred varieties. So we'll see starred varieties from a 1.8 to a 2.8, if that makes sense to everyone. The point I want to make there is, maturity group, it does play a role in yield, but we generally see that's probably the 9th or 10th thing you should look at in terms of making your decision. Where we see some of those early maturity group beans fit in was being able to get cover crops established on time or early, or winter wheat established. So again, just something to think about in terms of the maturity group and what role they play in the system. All right. So one of the advantages that I have of running the variety testing program as part of mine, and Laura has a similar type of advantage, is we get to assess all of these traits as they come into the marketplace. All right, on a basically a uniform basis. So when Roundup Ready to Yield came out in 2009, we saw a significant 2 to 4 bushel yield increase across all the Roundup Ready to Yield beans over all Roundup Ready 1. 2 to 4 bushels across the state of Wisconsin was significant. All right. So now that we see the Extend varieties come into our system, we're able to evaluate these. So what we can look at right here, we had 219 unique varieties. 124 of them were the Extend soybeans. 95 were the Roundup Ready to Yield soybeans. For the second year in a row, averaged across all varieties, just looking at platform versus platform, we saw the Roundup Ready to Yield beans still at yield 2 bushels greater than the Extend beans, okay, in our maturity group classes. Now the question is why? All right. Now we dig into this a little bit further, and what we noted in our climate, because we have a certain pathogen called white mold. Has anyone ever heard of it? Okay. Never heard of it? You're lucky. Lucky. So what we saw there is on average an 8% greater incidence level on average across all the Extend beans versus the non-Extend beans, and that is where that 2 bushels likely came from, is the sensitivity to white mold. Okay? Now I'm not saying that the trait is susceptible. It was just the germplasm that it was brought into the breeding program initially appears to be more sensitive to white mold, if that makes sense to everybody. So that's where our yield difference came from. Most likely is the incidence of white mold. And again, at these levels, we are still getting yield loss in our Roundup Ready yields over our Extends. But again, it was 8% greater in that situation. Now, with that being said, I don't want to throw this technology under the bus. All right? Because as we say, we have these starred systems in our program. And in every single one of our regions across the state, we saw starred varieties in both our Extend platform and the base Roundup Ready to Yield platform. So the point I want to get at is do not select a variety on platform alone. Okay? Every variety needs to do what? Yield. Stand on its own. Assess them independently by variety. Now I know it's a challenge how quickly these varieties turn over, because in our platform, in our program, 10 years ago when I went to Wisconsin, we had 80% of our varieties translated from year to year. Okay? There's 80% carryover from one year to the next. What percent carryover do you think I'm at now? What percentage of varieties I had in 2016? Do you think I had the same varieties in 2017? What percentage? 20 to 30%. So the turnover is very rapid. So one of the things we want to make sure is that when you're assessing these varieties and adding these new cultivars, look at Laura's trial, look at Purdue's trial, look at industry data, look at FIRST data. But I want to caution you, because not everyone knows this, but in the FIRST data, not all the variety information is published. Only the top third of varieties is published in FIRST trial data. All right? Do you all know that? Some of you said yes, some of you said no. The reason that it's important, I think it's important to know, just as important to know, how bad the bad ones were versus how good the good ones were. Does that make sense? Because that helps you as a farmer understand the variability of that variety. Because as we move forward in doing our variety selections in this day and age, you need to understand that variability. And I always caution growers not to put too much emphasis on your varieties that you put on your field last year. Because how many of you are farmers here? Okay. How many of you run your own variety trials? Okay. Many of you do. What does that tell you? How well that variety performed where? When? Last year. Exactly. So it is one piece of information, but it shouldn't be your entire piece of information. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, good. Well, I just want to make sure we talk about that and understand some of the challenges. Back to the white mold topic. How many of you have ever suffered from white mold before? All right. I want to make you aware, my pathologist colleague, his name is Dr. Damon Smith, he is developing 2 apps that will be out May 1. The first app is a white mold prediction app. You have it loaded on your iPhone. You go to your field, you drop a pin, you run the model. It gives you a low, medium, or high risk for white mold. It helps you make decisions for spraying. Generally, what farmers have found with this app is that it helps them make that decision specifically for pulling the trigger the first time, or if you're in an approach program or a 2-pass program for white mold, it helps you maybe avoid that second pass if it's not necessary. Does that make sense? So that's the first app. It'll be out the first week in May. The second app is a fungicide calculator app. What it does is taking all of the fungicide efficacy data from all the plant pathologists in the northern region of the country that deal with white mold, and they're building an economic calculator so you as a farmer or a retailer can put in the cost of application, the cost of the product, okay? Hit run, and it will rank those spray programs based on your highest probability of return on investment, okay? So those are the 2 apps coming for white mold efficacy. Be looking forward to them in May. Any questions on those? Okay, if you want to find out more about this, feel free to either go to my website, which is www.coolbean.info, or follow me on Twitter. That's probably the easiest way. I'm at BadgerBean is my Twitter handle. So as soon as those apps come out, I will just push it out on Twitter so you'll be able to understand and download those apps. And they will be free for any farmer or retailer to download because they were built with checkoff dollars. So the research generated from that will be either from the local state boards or from funding from the North Central Soybean Research Program. Okay? So again, that was your checkoff dollars at work. Speaking of checkoff dollars, is Keith in here? Do you have your iPad on today? Okay, good. That's good. We were at a meeting and I got up to speak for the first time and Keith decided to hit play on his iPad and was making all sorts of sounds while I was speaking, so I want to thank him for that opportunity. All right, now let's get into my yield gap, our, because we're all about sharing in soybean. Okay, a couple quick questions. What percent of U.S. soybeans do y'all think are raised in the North Central region? Those are the 12 states in the upper North Central region. What percentage of U.S. soybeans are grown here? 80 to 85%. That's 30% of world production is based in those 12 states. It's pretty amazing. And one of the focus points that we're working on is this project funded through the North Central Soybean Research Program is to figure out what that yield gap is in these areas. And that yield gap, again, for those of you who aren't aware what that terminology means, that's the difference between the genetic yield potential of soybean, and I would argue it would roughly be 120 bushels per acre in the North Central region, and what your attainable on-farm yield average was. So, Laura, what was the average yield last year in Ohio? Not great. Roughly 48. Okay, so if the genetic yield potential is 120 and you all average 48, what's the difference between those two numbers? A lot? A lot of dollars. That is the yield gap. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do, is be able to utilize information, okay, to be able to minimize that yield gap. So the data I'm going to be speaking from today constitutes the first 2 years of data collection. All right. So if you look at, and Ohio did a wonderful job, and as of right now, I just looked it up, Ohio has supplied 813 fields to this database. Okay, with more yet to come. All right, so I just want to give Dr. Lindsay a kudos here and her team at Ohio State for being able to pull in 813 fields from the state of Ohio that goes into this database. So again, each one of these pins represents a farm field, okay? And what we're able to do with this information, here's the team, here's the wonderful team of experts, if you will. There's Dr. Lindsay. I always make a point to point out, whenever I show this slide, it always takes 3 people from Iowa to do the same job as 1 person in Ohio, okay? I don't know why, but it always seems to take as much effort from Iowa as it was everyone else. They argue because they're more important, but blah, blah. Anyone here from Iowa State? Thank goodness. Okay. All right. Now, many of you have probably seen this, this example if you've come across your field. So this is the data collection sheet that we're utilizing. It's very simple. And we're basically taking all of the agronomic production data that you are doing as farmers on your farm and entering it into this database. With that, then we also ask for your GPS locations for that farm field. And I will show you why in a second. But again, it's very simple stuff that we can look at, specifically planting date, row spacing, seeding rate, seed treatments, foliar fungicides, insecticides, etc. Okay? Then the reason we ask for your GPS locations is we can go into the Sergo database and we can pull in all the soils data from your specific fields. We also pull in all of the weather data during that entire growing system. And this all gets compiled into this massive database. So how many of you have heard an ag engineer talk about big data? Okay? How many of you heard anyone talk about big data? How many of you have ever heard anyone speak about the data they've collected from big data? Nobody. Nobody. Well, that's what we're trying to do, is develop, and we've, I think, been very successful in understanding how we take this huge data set of grower-generated data and deliver agronomic recommendations from that. So one of the questions then comes up, all right, so we go back to this map here. All right, how do you, Conley, or whoever's working on this project, take a field from northeast Ohio and make any comparisons with something in North Dakota? Yeah, hey. How do you make those comparisons? Does anybody have any idea? What we're able to do then is utilize this technique called these TEDs, all right? And this is an example of a TED. I'll go back to that. But these TEDs take your annual total growing degree days, your aridity index, basically how what's the likelihood of droughtiness on that field, your annual temperature, and your plant water holding capacity. So, I always love it when they take pictures. They always post, how many of you ever got your picture taken when you're speaking before? You know which one they always take a picture of? When your mouth is wide open or things like that. Anyway, you got it? Perfect. That will be the flyer for the next time for this meeting they invite me back here. You know, at least my finger isn't my nose or something like that. So again, what we're able to do then is take all this data and we cluster them according to these TEDs. And these are these technology extrapolation domains. Yada, yada, yada. What does that mean? That allows us to be able to pool similar fields with each other so we have a high enough amount of data that we can make statistical inferences from. All right? So roughly what we need is a minimum of 90 fields to fall within a TED, okay? And then what that allows us to do, it gives us an LSD of roughly 3 bushels per acre. And then what we can do is pull out management practices that farmers are doing on those TEDs and rank them accordingly to how important they are for production. This is kind of a brief example of this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time. This just shows the ranges in planting dates, maturity groups here. Topsoil pH, subsoil pH, the amount of P2O5, K2O applied, seeding rate. This is our technology wetness zones. Anyway, again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this gives us an idea here of some of our TEDs. And what we can look at here is this is our average yields in each one of these TEDs. And I noticed for Ohio, for example, many of you fell in a TED 2R, where that average yield was roughly 62 bushels per acre, but we had some over 70 and some under, around 50 in terms of the fields that came in. the important part to point out is up here is this coefficient of variation. Because we get into some of these low-yielding environments, some challenging environments like 3R, which would be Ohio. Not Ohio, excuse me. That would be North Dakota. So we have a CV of 21%. That just tells us there's a lot of variability in that data, and it's harder to pull that information out. So this gives you kind of a scope of the data. All right? This is boring. Here's a cool slide. Okay. Hey, I'm just being honest. All right?
All of it's boring.
Oh, come on. So this is where the entomologist hates the agronomist, is this slide right here. Okay? I wasn't going to point it out, but you had to open up your yap. Now I'm going to get in trouble. Okay, so let's get into this and look at these major management factors across these different TEDs. Okay, so for those of you in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, kind of these colorations gives you an idea. I do know there's a lot of 1Rs and 2Rs in this area. So let's look at the difference between tilled and no-till production across these TEDs. Here's yield for the tilled and no-till. This black line across the center, that's a 1-to-1 relationship. So if it falls on that line, it doesn't matter if you till or no-till, you get the same yield. All right? Does that make sense of how this graph is put out? Each one of these circles then represents a TED. So here would be 3R. All right? And what we noticed is we roughly see a 2 to 3, that's probably a 3.5 bushel yield increase for every farmer that's in TED 3R, and the advantages of tilling versus no-till. Okay? Do you all understand how to read this information? So again, what this allows us to do is get an idea of how well, depending on tillage or other major management factors we have. This data is crucial and vital for farmers so that when we are dealing, because I know you're dealing a lot with water quality issues in the state of Ohio. I understand, it's all of the country is dealing with that, but I know specifically there's a lot of effort put forward in Ohio. One of the questions we can have is, well, there's TED 2R, which is many of you are in 2R, which is that green coloration. There's roughly a 2 to 2.5 bushel yield penalty for going no-till versus tilled in the state of Ohio in TED 2R. Okay? Why is that important? That is important when you go and work with regulators, when you work with groups that are saying you need to do this. Okay? You have what I call informed pushback. That you have data in your hand that says, I understand, we want to move that direction. However, we see a 2.5 bushel yield penalty if we go no-till in this TED. Who's paying for that? How do we mitigate that situation? Does that make sense to everybody? The power of this data? It's pretty cool. The other one we can look at here is drainage. Okay? Artificially drained versus not artificially drained. It's not a surprise to anyone here that's grown soybeans that soybeans like tile. Would anyone argue that they don't like tile? Okay? Then if you would, you've never grown soybeans. Okay? Soybeans like tile. Again, it gets into that question then, if you are in an area where they're trying to minimize your capacity to tile, this data can say, hey, fine, I'm losing 6 bushels if I don't tile that land or fix my existing tile. Does that make sense to everybody? This is cool, powerful, farmer-generated data that you all can use for your purposes as farmers. Here's the one where plant pathologists and entomologists hate us. Okay? This is the difference between no foliar fungicide and or insecticide versus the application of foliar fungicide and or insecticides. What do you see there? There's a big yield advantage due to the application of foliar fungicides and insecticides on soybeans across many of these TEDs. All right? So what we're working on now is the why. So Paul Easker, who is he's not our, he used to be in Wisconsin, he moved to Costa Rica. I was supposed to go to sabbatical in Costa Rica, spend time with Paul. He decides to move to Penn State University. I'm not going to sabbatical at Penn State University. So I had to cancel my sabbatical to Costa Rica. But the point I want to make here is he's an epidemiologist, and what we're going through is the entire database of varieties, looking at the susceptibility. what pathogens are in these certain environments, and modeling why we see responses. I mean, some of these responses are crazy. That's an 8 bushel, 9 bushel yield increase with the application of foliar fungicides and insecticides in the relative absence of some of these pests. Nuts. We want to know why. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Most of these are tank mixed. In most states, I would say 60% of them, except for the state of Nebraska. If you go up to North Dakota, most of that is just insecticide only. In most of the rest of the U.S., if they're putting a fungicide in, they're throwing what in just in case? Insecticide. Yep. Similar type of responses. Okay. So again, we want to dig in, and again, this is not capturing the IPM aspect that we discussed. The resistance. If you look in the state of Iowa, how many of you have ever sprayed for frog eye leaf spot? Well, they have, guess what? Resistance to some of the strobies. The strobies already for frog eye leaf spot have been detected in the states of Kentucky and in Iowa now. And I would guess in here too, in Ohio too. So again, we need to remember resistance management and IPM. But again, the question is, when we discuss with farmers are seeing that. Okay? So we have to kind of dig into this. So again, just want to bring everyone up to speed. Another cool thing we can talk about here is, so what time is it actually? So do I really only have 15 minutes? No. Oh, I got a half hour. Okay, good. Because I got like 6 hours more of the material left. All right. Oh, you think I'm kidding? Yeah. Thank you. That's why these otter boxes are very handy, because I always drop it. All right. Anyway, so we get into this. Now, how many of you have ever been to an agronomy meeting? Okay, do you guys know where you're at right now? Okay, this is an agronomy meeting. Okay? What is, besides variety selection, what's the number 2 thing that agronomists talk about, regardless if it's corn or soybeans? What is it? Planting date. Perfect. Now, I want to dig into some of these planting date responses because you see this variability. And what we're able to do is dig into these different TEDs and characterize the response to planting date. So if we go to TED 2R, all right, okay, which is parts of Indiana, a little bit here in Ohio, we see past April 20th, a 0.15 bushel per acre per day yield loss by delaying planting in TED 2R. Let's go to TED 1R, Michigan, this darker green across Ohio. We see a half a bushel per acre per day yield penalty by delaying planting past April 20th in those TEDs. So we were able to characterize, based on these TEDs, that planting date response, which helps growers make some of these decisions. Do I plant corn first? Do I plant soybeans first? You should always plant soybeans first, because they are the most important crop. I know the best way I found to manage corn is Select Max. It does a wonderful job in managing corn. Okay? See, I have some followers, and I'm not, Fusion does a good job too. Fusilade. I want to make sure I'm fair across all the different companies here. So why does this go into this? Now, the other cool thing I thought was, of any state, which state you think would respond the most to planting date? It'd be North Dakota, right? Who would have thought North Dakota would be the best state? What is the response to planting date in North Dakota? 0. Doesn't matter when the hell you plant. Okay? In North Dakota. Oh yeah, that's right, I'm being taped. Please bleep that last thing out. And any Trump joke I will eventually get to. Okay. Next. So why is that? Okay. Why are we seeing these variable responses to these planting dates? And it gets into this question about water balance and water availability during that seed fill period. So we're able to go through and model that information. So what this tells you, this is your yield penalty due to sowing date. Okay. Basically, what is your yield penalty for delaying planting past April 20th here? And this is your water balance during pod setting, basically seed fill. And as we get into some of these droughtier sections, 2R, okay, we see that on average, farmers in TED 2R see a negative 3-inch water balance during pod fill. So in those areas, you are not seeing the advantage of early planting because of drought, water stress in August. Does that make sense to everyone? So this is where you can start penciling out numbers with irrigation or timing of your plantings to help play with some maturity groups to avoid some of these water balance issues. And I know I did a question, we were speaking earlier about sub-furrow irrigation. Irrigation, what is it? What were we talking about, Keith? Sub-irrigation. Making that pencil out. Well, if you look here, and if you notice, if you're in these areas where you're losing 0.45 bushels per acre per year by delaying that planting date because of that water balance, you can start running the numbers and the economics and say, can I afford to put that irrigation in? Can I afford to do sub-irrigation? Because then I could take advantage of this planting date response. Does that make sense to everybody? Because you're able to put the water on that crop when it needs it. Does that make sense? Okay, awesome. SDS. I don't have a lot of time. SDS is bad. Any questions? We're good? Okay. I'm going to skip through a bunch of this stuff because you've probably seen it before. Blah. I'll talk about my app. Yeah, I'll talk about my app thing quick. I'll get to the SDS stuff in a second because we did some work with iLevo. So for any of you that are not aware of this, so the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board, again, I have, along with all of my colleagues, have all this planting date, seeding rate type of trials. So we took all of our data and built an iPhone app. It's called BeanCam, B-E-A-N-C-A-M. It's free to download on either your iPhone or your Android database. Again, it was paid for by the Wisconsin Soybean Marketing Board, so it's free. And what you as a farmer do is you just download it. You go in and you basically select your crop growth stage. You also go in and figure out your row spacing. And then you just physically walk around and take pictures with your phones. How many of you have ever thrown a hula hoop counting soybeans before? Okay, how many like doing that? Okay, nobody. This allows you to basically go through and use your camera as an app to estimate stand. So here is what you see. This is what your camera sees. What do you not see between these rows? Weeds. Because there should not be any weeds out there. Am I correct? None. Critical period for weed control is basically V1 to V3 on soybeans. That means they should be clean at that point. All right? So I'll get off of that bandstand and go back because Bill Johnson will bore you later on with weeds. Okay? Now, you go through, you take your photos, and here's one of my PhD students, Marion Lunn, and hopefully I'm trying to recruit an Ohio State grad to come up to UW-Madison. So this is a recruiting trip, so thank you for paying for me to come down to recruit grad students from Ohio to Wisconsin, so thank you. Thank you very much. You'll get my bill.
We're happy to help.
Excellent. Yeah, I always make fun of Iowa State people, so I'm glad they're not here to hear this. I always say that's the best junior college I get transfers from to come to Madison. So we go through here, and we start, we take our photos, and we get here to our estimated population of 80,000 plants per acre. That is your percent maximum yield, 97%. All right? How many believe that number? How many think I'm full of crap? Okay, 2 or 3 people. There's more of you than that. Okay, this is very accurate because it's on the web. Okay? So trust me. No, this is a ton of data, and that's one of the next meta-analysis we're getting to. But the cool thing with this, I'll give you a little history behind this. So about 4 or 5 years ago, the United Soybean Board funded a bunch of, and the North Central Soybean Board and state boards. It was a big collective effort to look at the yield, genetic yield gain in soybean. And what we did is we basically had germplasm from like 1924 all the way to 2014, about 73 different lines. We were looking at all these responses. I know you've seen that data because I've presented it here in the past. What we found is why that 80,000 is real today is because today's varieties put on 3 times the amount of yield on branches as varieties that were developed 30 years ago. There's 3x yield on branches. That's why today's varieties can handle these lower populations and not see the yield penalty. We basically cut that yield penalty in half over what it used to be. All right? It's pretty cool, is what we've done with that. So my point here is, if you don't believe this number, I say fine, here's your recommendation to replant at 60,000 plants per acre. Fill in that existing stand by dropping roughly 60,000 seeds. And what percent yield gain do you get? 1%. Okay.
What's wrong with those beans?
What beans?
They look sick.
It's, oh, that's the monitor. No, these were grown in Ohio. That was the problem. They look really green in Wisconsin. I tell you, you are all warned. If you come after me, I'm coming back swinging. Okay.
It says Wisconsin soybeans right there. It says Wisconsin soybeans.
Well, that's because I didn't put any nitrogen on. You know, I should have put like 500 pounds of nitrogen on in front of these. That's another joke. Okay. That's a different paper and another talk. Don't do it. Okay. So now, the point I want to get here is twofold. Number one, we see on 70% of the soils in Wisconsin, and I'm not going to speak for Ohio because I don't live here, and I noticed Laura Lindsay was on last to correct all of my mistakes. We see roughly in 70% of soils in Wisconsin, all you need is 100,000 plants to maximize yield. Okay? On drier soils, where you see like basically heavy clays, we need 140,000 plants at harvest to maximize yield. All right? Does that make sense? Kind of the differences between that. So it's the exact opposite between corn and soybeans. We actually see you need more plants on drier soils with soybean than the opposite would be on corn. All right? So the point I want to make here is I tell farmers between 50 and 80,000 plants per acre, don't do anything because your ROI is 0 for putting seed in that area. And you want to see the published data? It's on my website, coolbean.info, free to look at it. I'd much rather have you invest in an in-season residual herbicide to manage it than putting more seeds out there. Because even if you get a free replant, okay, is that really free seed? Do you as a farmer have to pay someone to plant it? Yes. Do you have to burn fuel? Yes. Time? Equipment wear and tear? Invest in a residual herbicide. Under 50,000, fill it in and leave the existing stand. Okay? So anyway, feel free to download this. That's the report you get. And you can just, if you're a crop consultant, you can email that report directly from your phone to your the retailer, whoever. So just feel free to utilize that. All right. Let's get into this question right here. So as we get into these tough economic times, farmers are talking about cutting back some things. And I know one of them is seed treatments. So I want to talk about ILevo a little bit because I did touch on the SDS question, which was we all decided it was what? Bad. Perfect. If you learned anything, we already knew that one. So here is our economic analysis, and I've probably shown this before, but I want to reiterate it. So our base case scenario is we're basically going 140,000 untreated seed. Dropping 140,000 seeds treated with ILevo, there's an 87% of probability of return on investment. Okay? On average, that farmer is going to make $7 an acre. Okay? This is in some of the fields where there's just, if you don't have SDS, obviously then you would just go with this one right here, which would be the commercial base, which in this case would be the Poncho Votivo plus the base product for Bayer. In that case, there's a 70% probability of return on investment, and you're up $4 an acre if you don't have SDS. We see similar stuff with the Cruiser Max platform. In short, don't cut your seed treatments in 2018 to cut costs. The interesting thing that we note is the economic optimal seeding rate. Okay, let's use the ILevo as a case example, is dropping 103,000 seeds per acre. There's a 99% probability of return on investment, and on average, the farmer is going to make $16 an acre. Okay, now I'm not pushing everyone to drop 103,000 seeds per acre, all right? But this gives you a sense of where that is. Any questions on this table? And again, this is on my website if you want to go dig into it a little bit further. All right, next. So now I want to dig in, and we've talked about the macro parts of these TEDs. Let's talk about the micro, the interactions, which is the cool stuff. So again, let's focus on this TED 1R. All all right, which is parts of Michigan here, parts of Ohio. So this is how these TEDs are framed. So what we do is we utilize basically this, the type of analysis we use is AI, artificial, AI intelligence to be able to run these models. And what that does is it takes the bias off of what me or us as researchers have for a specific project. How many of you are biased towards something? You should all raise your hands. I mean, you are all biased that Ohio State is a superior university to Wisconsin. How many agree with that one? I would hope you would say that. If not, would you like to come to Wisconsin? I'm recruiting here today. So again, we all have our biases. So this type of data analysis or analytics pulls that bias off of us, all right? And lets the computer do all the iterations. So we've taken all of those variables and we sorted out these types of interactions. The first one is planting date. So in TED 1R, the most important thing you can do is plant early. That drives the ship. Okay, if for whatever reason, like last year, you were precluded from planting early because it rained every day for 3 weeks, okay? Then we start looking at these driving factors. So this TWI would be a wetness index, and this subsoil pH are some of these drivers. So again, what this allows us to do is parse out the drivers of yield in TED 1R, okay? Let's go into another one. Forgot I had these all individually looped in here. Okay, let's go to 2R. And in this case, what's driving yield? Row spacing. Craziness. That's it. That's the biggest driver in TED 2R. All the other management factors don't matter. It's row spacing that's driving the management in that factor. All right? Craziness. And we're looking here. And what do you see between these two? Which row spacing has highest yield? The medium and wide. So anything 15 inches or greater. What do we tell farmers to do to increase yield? Narrow row spacing. What does this tell us that we're full of? Beans. Thank you. Whoever said beans, I appreciate that one. So now what we're doing is we're digging into this a little bit more to figure out what's driving that. Why does this go against everything that we've been telling you as agronomists for 30 years? What is the biggest driving factor of why we're seeing that response to wider rows? Okay? White mold could be, but a lot of these weed could be seed treatment, these interactions. That is the cool stuff that we can parse out in these. So this helps growers in these areas make these decisions. All right? They should not invest here. They should invest in a row spacing 15 inches or wider, where many of them have. But again, it helps you as a farmer make some of these decisions. So this is cool stuff. So one thing we're doing is we have another grad student. He's down in Nebraska. And if anyone's looking to become a department head in Nebraska, they're looking. Okay, they're searching to see if anyone cares. And what he's able to do is we're going to be looking at satellite imagery on all of these fields. We have the base management practices and modeling the water efficiencies and trying to characterize why we see these responses. So it's very cool stuff coming from these large data sets. All right, let's go to another TED. Let's go to 5R. See these orange, you might not see the back. There is some 5R in this north central part of Ohio. Okay, here's a cool one. Subsoil pH is one of the biggest drivers. First one is planting date, and if you plant early, that subsoil pH between 5.5 and 6.5 was the highest yielding in that TED 2R. I'm sorry, 5R. Here's another cool thing that popped out. Okay, let's go back to this one. Foliar fungicide. Okay, you plant late, you don't use foliar fungicide, you get 51 bushels per acre. You plant late, use foliar fungicide, you get 57. There's a 6 bushel yield gain in TED 5R from putting foliar fungicide on your late planted beans. So, as a plant pathologist, I'm not, but I pretend to be one from time to time, especially if Ann Dorrance isn't around. Is she in here? Oh, she's not here. Whew. All right, then I'll be good. So, if you're agronomists and you're trying to help growers make decisions to target a foliar fungicide application, all right, you always say, if you were given a choice to spray a foliar fungicide on your early planted beans or your late planted beans with no prior knowledge, which one would you tell growers to spray? Early. How many would say early? We all would. What does this tell us? We're full of beans. It's the late planted bean. Now, is it because of, why is that? That's the question. Is it because of frog eye coming in and on those late planted beans? What's driving that factor? So again, this allows us as agronomists to parse this information out and then go into these interactions and ask the questions why. Okay, that's the cool stuff. Last one I want to talk about is 6R. 6R doesn't show up on this map, but it'll show up on the next one you all see. We just didn't have enough fields in the first 2 years of data, but you will have some 6R in the next iteration of data when we get the other 800 fields put into the system. So in this case, seed treatments drive it in TED 6R and this fact of nematodes right here. Oops, let me go back to this one. So what we see, if you know you have nematodes, and how many of you know you have nematodes? How many have sampled for SCN in the last 5 years? Excellent. How many of you have never sampled for SCN? Okay. Does the Ohio State pay, does the checkoff board pay for them?
They, I think, will this year for the first time.
Okay. All right, well, I'll get into that in a second. So what we noticed here is that if you find out you have nematodes, we see a 3-bushel difference between tilled and no-till, where the conventional till beans have 3 bushels more soybeans than our no-till beans when nematodes are in the system. All right. Now, for those of you unaware of this, the new Sen Coalition was developed and launched again at Commodity Classic last week in Anaheim. This is how many of you remember the Take the Test, Beat the Pest program that was in the 90s? How many of you have gray hair? Okay, then how many of you have no hair? Okay. You would remember that from the 90s. So there was a big push during the 90s for this. Most farmers sampled it. They found out, I have SCN, so I did what? Nothing. Close. You started planting SCN resistant soybeans. All right. Greg Tilke's data from the Iowa State University decided to basically look at the role of PI8788 now. And what he's found is that on all of his variety test locations, he has found that the varieties are overcoming PI8788 at a 10% reproduction rate, which means that they basically are resistant to that trait. So what we're trying to get farmers to do is understand PI8788 is no longer carrying the water fully. So you need to retest, consider other mechanisms of resistance. Peking would be the primary one. And then also look at other things such as seed treatments in the case. And it could be the Poncho Votivo. It could be the Clariva. It could be the Nemastrike. If Monsanto ever figures out the itchiness problem that it has with that product, or the skin sensitivity, I should say. So again, I encourage you all to go back and retest your fields. Look for this. So this is spun off, and so this is being led by the United Soybean Board, the North Central Soybean Checkoff boards. Many of the states have signed on. Bayer is an industry partner. Syngenta is an industry partner. Who else? Growmark. Trying to think who else. There's a few other ones that are industry partners. So again, the goal of this new Sen Coalition is to develop uniform messaging and get you as farmers, you as crop consultants, speaking the same language and making management decisions to impact SCN. Okay, so be looking forward to this. And the new tagline is, what's your number? Okay? Now with that, I saved myself 10 minutes like I was supposed to for any types of questions related to soybean, small grains. I am now the industrial hemp expert. I preferred the medical hemp expert, but they haven't allowed that one yet, so maybe, knock on wood. Any questions? Yes, sir.
So, southwest Wisconsin, you get over 100 bush feet.
Yep.
Why?
Because I'm the agronomist in the state. Any other questions? So, So that part of the state is very, so they're able, it's very deep, lush soil. It's basically, we're able to get in. It has very good drainage. We're able to get in and plant early in those situations. And we've been able to consistently get over 100 bushel beans in that part of the state on our variety test trials, you know. And that's usually where our yield contest winners come from, is either Greene County, which is South Central, or they're Southwest, and they're consistently pulling in the high 90s for our yield contests on a field basis.
So you think it's soil and weather?
Yep. So how early is early? Our early is driven by crop insurance. Okay? Basically, I believe it's by a county level, and I think April 20th is the earliest most we're allowed to plant and still have some form of coverage for replants on that. But we have growers planting, you know, earlier than that. But if there is a challenge, they know what the crop insurance cutoff date was because they planted on that date. Yes, sir. Yeah. The question is there a way growers can find out? Yes, you could basically Google the Yield Gap Atlas. I think it's .org, and then you can look and find out with your GPS locations what TED you fall in. You may not be colored yet because we need 90 fields to color a TED for our LSD. But the next maps, when we have twice as much data, Ohio has many different new colors to it than just the 3 I have there. Yes, sir, in the back. The question is, do we have any experience with ilevo for cyst nematodes? Most of the efficacy that we've seen has been targeted at sun death syndrome. I do know Iowa State has done a little bit of work using the SCN rate, which is the 0.075 milligrams AI rate. So I have not looked at that rate specifically for SCN because we roughly only have about 20% of our fields have SCN in them. So we're more interested on the SDS side than that rate. But I mean, if you have SDS, if you have a known history of SDS, don't skimp with the 0.075 rate. The 0.15 rate that we used there was, what was that? An 80% probability of return on investment. So don't skimp if you're targeting SDS. Yes, sir.
What happened to the cup soybeans in your crop?
So what happened is the cup soybeans, it happened, I'll tell you the story. So it was basically the application of status in a nearby field, okay, in inversion, pulled the dicamba out of the status, came across the entire field, my field, and the soybean. And he grows seed beans for a company. And they were not extend beans, I can tell you that for sure. Because his fields were all cup too. But it happened in the reproductive time frame, in the vegetative time frame. So the yield loss was minimal. But I can't report it because I don't know. You know what I mean? It would be not unconscionable, but it would be inappropriate for me to, because there could have been injury. That's the thing with these synthetic auctions. You don't know. They screw things up. And you don't know if you're going to have a yield penalty or not. Because I don't want, so that's where we were. But I do know one thing for a fact, okay? Anyone that tells you that a synthetic auction increases soybean yield is full of beans. That is a fact. That's the fact, Jack. So don't believe any of that horse hockey that you read on the internet. Only stuff appropriate that's actual and factual on the internet comes from coolbean.info. Okay? That's it. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
Some reports say that American beans are going lower in protein. Will that be an export problem? Is it accurate?
So the question is about our U.S. soybeans and protein. I think our biggest export problem is our president, tell you the facts. And the fact that he wants to put a tariff on steel, that's going to be our #1 export problem with soybeans to begin with. So there's my one political Trump reality. That's not a joke. So beyond the protein part of things. So there's actually 2 points to that. So we've noticed that over time, in the chase for yield, we have precipitously dropped our protein content. both through breeding efforts and agronomic practices. Okay? Planting early, guess what that does to your protein content, folks? It drops it. If you are growing soybeans for a high protein type of a delivery point, food grade, don't plant early because you will get a protein dock. We usually say at least a point protein difference, if not more, planting early. Okay? So genetics and our agronomic practices pushing towards higher yield has dropped our protein content. On the flip side, there is a team, many teams, but working on what's the rest of the story. How many of you remember Paul Harvey? Okay? What's the rest of the story? And the rest of the story comes back to what is in that soybean seed in terms of its essential amino acids. So that's where a large team within USB and different states and regions are working on how does that amino acid profile impact the industry. Because we've been selling beans on what? Protein, 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 protein. Oh yeah, there's some oil in there. Protein, protein. What is the protein a carrier of? Those essential amino acids that are in hogs. Feed the hog rations, feed the chicken rations, feed the fish rations. There's a big, all the fish, and those are more important, I would argue, than the protein itself. So that's where we're at with that, if that helps you, sir.
Shawn, there was one on that side.
Yes, sir.
You talked about the branching, the new varieties
Yep.
have more pods on the branches.
Yep.
Could that be the reason wider rows in Ohio are
Yep.
more beneficial because the varieties have changed?
Could be.
now?
Yep.
And what, does that relate then to lower populations, giving us more yield?
Yep. So the question was about these, what the capacity of soybeans today now to branch more, have 3x more yield on the branches. Is that what could be driving the yield effect for the medium and wide rows here in that TED2R? Very, very, very well could be. I remember when I first got into this job when I was at Purdue, that would have been like 15 years ago, they were kept selling beans on, well, this is a branching bean and this is an erect bean. Okay? Remember that marketing stuff? Okay? Well, guess what an erect bean does in a low population in wide rows? It branches. Because if you think about it, what row spacing do breeders advance their lines on and do the crosses on? 30-inch rows. So they're not going to advance a bean if it does not perform well. And that's why breeders have selected for that branching capacity, and they didn't even know it. Because breeders are pretty simple-minded. Well, it's true. What do? They just put yield into an Excel spreadsheet and sort by highest yield. And then, oh, those 10%, we're moving forward. My 11-year-old can breed. Breed soybeans. Soybeans, folks. Out of the gutter. Out of the gutter. That's my daughter. It'd be funny. Never mind. I got to stop. So there we go. Yeah, you can delete that last part in there. That would be wonderful. Any other?
One last question for Shawn.
Thank you for your time. Remember, follow me on Twitter. Thank you.